Hello and welcome. You're watching To The Point. 18 months into the Modi government, how would you characterize Indo-US relations? How does America assess the achievement in Paris over the climate deal and the threat from ISIS? And what view does Washington take of the belief that in the near future, India and Pakistan will begin a comprehensive bilateral dialogue? Those are the two key issues I shall raise today with United States former Deputy Secretary of State and the present President of the Brookings Institution, Strobe Talbot, and former Assistant Secretary of State and President Obama's former Special Envoy to the Middle East, Martin Indyk. Gentlemen, let's start with Indo-US relations 18 months into the Modi government. Strobe Talbot, during that time, both President Obama and Prime Minister Modi have met at least 7 times. Today, how would you characterize the relationship between the two countries?
Healthy, mature, and I think it's in a world where there's a lot of bad news, the U.S.-India relationship is good news.
Has it improved significantly since Mr. Modi took over?
In a couple of respects, yes. I think it's a mistake to underestimate the importance of the chemistry, the personal relationship between leaders. Maybe some would be surprised by this. I wasn't. The two leaders, your Prime Minister and our President, seem to have bonded when they had their first summit. I think that relationship is still strong, and now it's become institutionalized in that the interaction, consultation between the two governments is both broad and deep.
I want to pick up, Martin Indyk, on that point made there by Strobe Talbot about the two heads of government bonding. The view in Delhi is that they've established a close personal rapport, which is now lifting the relationship between their countries. Is that a view that you also share?
I do, and that is surprising on the American side, because President Obama is not known for having strong personal relations with foreign leaders. It's not his strong suit. He's not a warm and cuddly type president. And
nor many people would have said is Mr. Modi.
Well, maybe they have some things in common. I can't judge that, but judge by the way in which they are relating to each other and the way in which they're constantly engaging with each other on the phone or in these summits, not just the bilateral summits, but the international summits, demonstrate, I think, a significant personal relationship which reinforces the very strong bonds that are being established between the two countries.
Let's come to areas where perhaps there isn't as much clarity as one would like to hold. But in January, when President Obama came to India, he said that a breakthrough understanding had been achieved on the nuclear liability issue. But at virtually the same time, the New York Times paper said that the outcome was vague and inconclusive. It was like kicking the ball into the long grass. Now, 11 months later, not a single American company has moved to set up a nuclear plant in India. Does that suggest that the New York Times skepticism was more accurate than the president's description?
Well, I think the president's description was, let's put it this way, aspirational. Ever since the nuclear deal was done, there has been, in contrast to the immediate euphoria at the time that it was signed, it has been a bit of a disappointment on both sides, but that's in large part because the technical issues are so difficult. So I just think we're just going to have to be patient, keep working on it, and my sense is that both sides are prepared to stay at it.
But then, if it was aspirational rather than actual, what do you think the president meant when he said a breakthrough understanding has been achieved?
Well, it turned out to be not such a breakthrough. And we've seen that before. When the deal was first done, it was celebrated as a breakthrough, and all good things were going to happen. But you know where the devils reside. They reside in the details.
So, in fact, the president was slightly over-gilding the lily. He was being slightly hyperbolic.
Presidents are allowed to do that because sometimes their hyperbole will actually bring about what they want.
It's possible that that could happen in this instance, Martin Indyk. A couple of days ago, just before the visit from the Japanese Prime Minister, India and Japan agreed on a memorandum of understanding, which India believes will lead fairly soon to a full-fledged deal on nuclear liability issues and a nuclear deal. And assuming the Japanese Parliament ratifies it, At that point, do you believe American companies like GE and Westinghouse will move expeditiously to set up plants in India, or are there still issues that could be hurdles that need to be solved?
I think these issues are going to have to be worked through before the climate is established in which the companies can come in and do their business. And so it's a question, I do think, of resolve to try to work these through as expeditiously as possible. It's taken a long time. I think that reflects the difficulty of the issues. But you know, there's goodwill on both sides, and it's really a question of doing whatever is possible to try to bring it to closure.
But you are suggesting that there are several hurdles that still need to be crossed, and simply securing a nuclear deal with Japan won't be the end of the problem.
I'm not sure that I can speak to that.
No, nor I, but Karen, if you permit, I would just underscore 2 points that that your question points out. First of all, another very strong relationship, both at the personal level and the political level, is between your Prime Minister and the Prime Minister of Japan. We've seen that, and I think it's a good thing, not least because the United States, India, Japan are all part of the G20, and which is what we now have as kind of a board of directors of the world. Second, on the nuclear issue, we know how and why it is so neuralgic in Japan after Fukushima and all that. But in the wake of Paris and the commitment that the world community is making to non-hydrocarbon energy, that is going to be give some momentum to nuclear energy.
Helped by the fact that Shinzo Abe and Narendra Modi also have a close personal relationship.
Yes.
A second issue that has come up recently, and it's an issue of concern in the relationship between the two countries, was highlighted in an interview to the Hindu newspaper by the president of the US-India Business Council, Mukesh Aghi, who says that American companies are waiting and willing to invest some $41 billion in sectors like infrastructure, defense, healthcare, e-commerce, and renewable energy, but Indian bureaucratic red tape and the absence of a bilateral investment treaty are holding things up. So let me ask you, what are the sort of issues that impede better and faster business relationships between American companies and India?
Well, there's a whole range of issues, but I think in particular intellectual property protection, the assurances that American corporations are going to need in terms of foreign direct investment regulations, dispute resolutions, mechanisms, and these kinds of things, things that need to be resolved. It hasn't held up the considerable boost in trade between the United States and India. I think it's a kind of threefold increase from $30 billion to $100 billion in bilateral trade. But in terms of these kinds of investment decisions by American companies that are looking at options in different parts of the world, I think they've come to expect a degree of protection for their interests and their investments that still needs to be worked out in India.
Indian industrialists, Tolbert, often say that the pace of reform is not fast enough, that some of the things they'd like to have seen happen, like GST, like land acquisition, haven't happened. Do American investors view India in the same way, that the pace of reform is slower than their expectation?
Well, I'm not sure that their expectations were as high, perhaps, as the business community in India. I was here not long after the election. But the short answer is yes, maybe not to the same degree. India has, ever since the early 1990s, come out into the world in a way that we all applaud, but there's obviously a way to go.
What about this bilateral investment treaty? How critical or crucial is it from America's point of view? The two countries have been discussing about one since 2008. Now, 7 years is a very long time to keep talking and not come up with a product. Is there frustration creeping in America over this issue?
Well, I don't feel it in Washington. That's not necessarily the best place to test the frustrations. But, you know, it's interesting that we have the same kind of creeping progress in the US-China relationship when it comes to bilateral investment treaties. So I think when it comes to resolving these issues in formal agreements, the bureaucrats on both sides get involved, and it will take both a will to move things internally in each of our governments and a will by the leaders to come together and say, come on, let's finish this now. And you know, I think it's time to try to resolve these things. It's time to recognize that there are a whole lot of other things moving, like the TPP trade agreements, India's interest in membership in APEC. On these fronts, you know, momentum is building, and it's important that India and the United States together are working to make sure that India is going to be part of this process.
So as long as there is a sense of momentum, business interests in America will remain satisfied that the movement is in the right direction, even if the pace at times is not fast enough.
I think that's right.
Let's come, gentlemen, to terror. You're visiting India just over a month after the terrible attacks in Paris, just over a couple of weeks after the terrible killing in San Bernardino, and both were claimed by ISIS. Now, on the 5th of this month, the British newspaper The Times wrote, and I'm quoting, "Islamic State fighters have captured swathes of eastern Afghanistan in a drive to establish a new province of the group's self-styled caliphate on territory straddling the border with Pakistan. Up to 1,600 fighters pledging allegiance to ISIS are ruling much of the 5 districts south of Jalalabad with the same ruthlessness that characterizes the group's regime in Syria and Iraq." Stoke Talbot, do you believe that ISIS has established a worrying and significant presence in Afghanistan?
Much more than that, Karen. We are looking at a phenomenon that is hard to believe could come about in the 21st century. And that is a movement of the most retrograde, brutal, atavistic kind is thriving, not only thriving as a movement, but declaring itself a state, acting like an aggressive, war-making state, a state that has basically declared war on the whole world, and using, in one sense, the most primitive and horrible of weapons out of the past, like machetes to chop off people's heads, but also using 21st century technology. And this is it is a world war in a very real sense, and it's one on which the U.S. and India are stalwartly together. Pakistan, Afghanistan are in the throes of it.
The key question for people in India, Martin Indyk, is ISIS now a threat directly to South Asia, to India, to Pakistan, or is it still mainly a Middle Eastern, Iraq, Syria-based phenomenon? In a manifesto released online earlier this month, this is what Islamic State said. The Islamic State would now expand beyond Iraq and Syria. It would now expand into India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Afghanistan. And the same manifesto went on to talk of Mr. Modi. They attacked him as a right-wing Hindu nationalist who is preparing his people for a future war against Muslims. As someone who's a Middle East expert, how seriously should this threat from ISIS be taken?
You know, what we've seen with ISIS is that they are constantly surprising us. First of all, in the way in which they broke out and took control of territory and have managed to hold on to it, despite really strong response in terms at least of the air power war that's being fought against them. So then we thought that all they were interested in was protecting their territorial caliphate, so-called, and expanding it, and that they wouldn't attack us in the West. Well, that proved to be wrong, as we saw in Paris and San Bernardino. And so I would not at all be confident or sanguine about the potential for them to create problems in your neighborhood. There is this franchise you refer to in Afghanistan. I wouldn't be surprised if some groups in Pakistan run up the black flag and say they're ISIS as well. But the potential for them to act here in the way that they've acted in other places cannot and should not be ignored.
And in that context then, is the talk of love jihad and conversions, the rhetoric you sometimes hear from right-wing people, often BJP members, about Muslims that is derogatory, sometimes even hate-filled, is that in a sense feeding into the sort of problem that ISIS can then benefit from?
Look, I'm not in a position to comment on your internal dynamics here, but I can talk about the phenomenon, similar phenomenon in the United States, where we have leaders in the heat of an election campaign, particularly Donald Trump, speaking out in ways that are divisive and really create a sense of we against them being Muslims generally, as opposed to the Islamic terrorists that are the problem here. And I think that in the United States context, that is problematic because it essentially starts to alienate a whole religious community which only serves the interest of ISIS.
And the same logic should apply to India, presumably.
Well, if I could pick up on that, Karen, I too want to be very careful and sensitive with regard to making any comments about your own country. But it's an objective fact. India has one of the largest Muslim populations in the world. So does Indonesia. And, you know, knock on wood, but I don't think it's a matter of luck. Both of your country and Indonesia, with these vast populations of Muslims, have not been so far susceptible to anything like what we're seeing in other parts of the world.
This, of course, underlines and emphasizes the importance of the international campaign against ISIS and the need to win and defeat ISIS. And certainly in a speech that he delivered from the Oval Office recently, President Obama has committed the United States to destroying ISIS. But Strobe Martin, can you seriously do that if at the same time you seek regime change in Syria? Has the time not come to accept what Angela Merkel and Laurent Fabius are saying, that the world might need the support and help of Bashar al-Assad to defeat ISIS, and that at least in the interim you need to either postpone or slow down attempts to remove him from office?
I respectfully, really very strongly disagree with that point of view, and I have heard it during our visit here to India. I've heard it elsewhere as well. As long as Assad is the leader of Syria, and given the horrible carnage, massacres of his own people, he is going to be part of the problem. It is very, very hard, I would say impossible, to imagine an end to the what started as a civil war, before we get into the ISIS piece, a civil war that he started. So there is going to have to be a change there. And the change is going to have Sunni buy-in, Shia buy-in, and international buy-in, and no Assad.
Let me put the same question to you, but I'll put it differently. People like Laurent Fabius, more recently, but Angela Merkel as well, say that it's possible to argue that Assad is part of the short-term solution to ISIS, even if he's part of a longer-term problem about what you do with Syria. And since ISIS is the immediate problem on hand, perhaps you need his support to defeat ISIS, and then come to the question of a transition, and then come to the question of what happens to Assad and his future. Does that make sense to you as a Middle East expert?
No.
Not at all?
No, the situation is very complicated there, and it doesn't lend itself to simple propositions. But I want to advance one simple proposition. ISIS cannot be defeated by Assad and the Alawites, Shias, backed by Iran and now Russia. They can only be effectively defeated by Sunni Muslims. They are a Sunni phenomenon, and without Sunni Muslims fighting them, in particular on the ground, they're not going to be defeated. Certainly Angela Merkel and Laurent Fabius are not prepared to put Western troops on the ground to take back the
Nor is Obama.
The territory. Nor is Obama. And therefore we need Sunni boots on the ground.
But they
it
are
cannot be
present.
done by Shia boots on the ground backed by Iran, because that will just inflame the sectarian dimensions of the conflict.
But
secondly,
Sunni boots are not on the ground either.
Sunni boots are on the ground fighting Assad at the moment. That's the Sunni opposition in Syria is fighting Assad. And the Russians have intervened against that Sunni opposition, not against ISIS. Therefore, we have to find a way to do both at the same time, to fight ISIS as if there were no Assad and fight Assad as if there were no ISIS, which is the only way that we're going to be able to put together a formidable coalition that is based on Sunnis destroying ISIS on the ground.
Do you believe the West will succeed, or the world will succeed, in doing what he calls both at the same time? Because you have Russia, part of the coalition, but actually venturing down a different road.
Yes, and a number of the key players need to back up from the roads that they're on and heading in another direction, which I think Martin has explained very well. If I could say a word about Russia. Russia, I think, is playing a game which may have earned it some prestige in the world as being a key actor there, but in the long run, remember that Russia has a considerable Muslim population of its own, more associated with the Sunni side than the Shia side, and as a result of the role that Russia, Putin in particular, is playing in Syria, he's doing two things. One, he is making more enemies in the Sunni world, some of whom are going to go in and feed the Muslim caliphate on Russian territory, and Russian citizens of Muslim background are going to fight in ISIS. So he's not doing himself and his country any favor. And then there's Saudi Arabia, which is bogged down in a kind of sideshow war, which is a quagmire, rather than putting troops against ISIS.
While we're talking about the Middle East and we're talking about ISIS, Martin, let me ask you about an interview given to Spiegel Online last month by General Mike Flynn, a former director of the United States Defense Intelligence Agency. And he said, and again I'm quoting him, that the Iraq War was a huge error. As brutal as Saddam Hussein was, it was a mistake to just eliminate him. The historic lesson is that it was a strategic failure to go into Iraq. And he adds that in fact the rise of Islamic State is the direct result of that war. Do you agree with that analysis?
In every respect except perhaps the most important one.
Which is?
Which is Saddam Hussein. Again, I see the flow in your argument that Assad and Saddam Hussein...
His argument, not mine.
No, I understand, but the idea that Assad can be a force for good here and Saddam Hussein could be a force for good. No, the problem then and the problem today is that in acting against these brutal dictators who've been rejected by their people but use brutality to remain in power, the way to deal with them is to make sure you have an answer to what happens the day after. George W. Bush had no answer to that question. We have to answer it. If we're serious about finding a different solution for Syria than Assad, we have to be able to say to the world, and in particular to Putin, what is going to happen the day after. So that's what's critical, is a political coalition of Syrians that will be able to stand up institutions that can prevent chaos following from the removal of Assad.
Could I just put one more hammerhead on that nail? The difference between Iraq under Saddam and Syria under Assad is that the chaos came after the regime change brought about by the United States in Iraq, and the chaos is now in Syria because of Assad himself.
Which is another reason for removing Assad.
Yes.
Gentlemen, let's take a break at that point. When I come back, I want to turn to the climate change deal in France and ask you, how do you assess it? And beyond that, I want to talk about India-Pakistan relations and how do you view the prospect that the two countries could be starting a composite bilateral dialogue early in the new year. We'll be back in a moment's time. Don't go away. Welcome back. You're watching To The Point, and my guests are former American Deputy Secretary of State Strobe Talbot and America's former Assistant Secretary of State and President Obama's former Special Emissary to the Middle East, Martin Indyk. Gentlemen, let's come to climate change. And let me start with you, Mr. Indyk. On the one hand, President Obama has said that the deal achieved in Paris is huge. President Hollande has described it as a beautiful revolution. But on the other, the concept of historical responsibility has been completely done away with. There are no legally binding targets for either emission cuts or finance. And most environmentalists believe that nowhere near enough has been done to ensure that the rise in temperature that happens is kept under 2 degrees, leave aside 1.5 degrees. So how do you assess the Paris outcome?
I think the critical thing that occurred in Paris was agreement among so many nations on what we can refer to as a kind of enduring architecture for dealing with precisely the problems that you point to, in particular slowing the warming of the planet to under 2 degrees. And there's an agreement on the objective, there's an agreement on mechanisms for trying to achieve that, and there is a process of accountability where each country has to report on its progress in doing so, and a variety of other mechanisms designed to encourage and support and also monitor how each nation is doing in this regard. So it's, yes, imperfect because we live in a world of states in which they are sovereign and they're the ones that are going to have to make the decision. But at least we have a consensus on a way forward, on an objective and mechanisms for achieving that objective.
There is a view, Strobe Talbot, and it may be in some senses similar to what you've heard from Martin Indyk, that the great achievement of Paris was to send out a strong moral message and to create an awareness of a type that perhaps hasn't existed up to this point of time. And that accounts for the accountability he spoke about, that accounts for the fact that they're going to have verifiable ways of checking on what's done. Do you agree with that view, that the moral message and the awareness is perhaps more important than the details of the achievement?
Well, the moral message is important, but it's that the way you characterize it, or you're quoting others who characterize it that way, it's a little too touchy-feely. There is concrete progress here. I would describe it as the construction of a platform that can be built on in the future, including trying to bring down the target goal.
Martin Indyk, one criticism that you hear in India is that if there is going to be any chance of limiting temperature rise to 2 degrees, leave aside 1.5 degrees, then the carbon space available to the world will be exhausted by 2030. Some people say perhaps a lot earlier. As a result of which, developing countries will not be allowed to grow and be condemned to poverty, or they'll have only one option, which is to break the Paris commitments. An analyst turn around and say that's like being caught between the devil and the deep blue sea.
Look, I do think that developing countries led by India have established the point that, and I think it's accepted, that developing countries have to be given room to grow, that they were not the original polluters. But that doesn't give them the right to exacerbate the problem now using the justification of growth. So we have to find a balance between these imperatives. The imperative that developing countries have necessarily to be able to grow, and India is critically in that camp, but on the other hand, not in the process to destroy the planet over time. And so therefore, the mechanisms become important. The investment in green alternatives becomes important. The question of what happens to the use of coal. And I think critically important in this context is technological innovation. And that is, I think, the great hope here, is that with a general agreement on the objective, technological innovation in green alternatives to fossil fuels can kick in here in real time. We're talking about in the next 5 to 10 years, dramatically reduce the price of things like solar energy, wind power, and also bring on nuclear energy in a way that will then create circumstances in which countries can both grow and protect the planet.
If I could, Karen, just one more point that's very important. We are still in a world where sovereign states are sovereign and will act on their own self-interest. The major developing countries, so-called, particularly India, is only going to go along with this whole scheme if it is to the benefit of India. India is very, very vulnerable to the effects of to climate change, and that is why your leadership, and with, I think, support from the Indian people, is going to stay with the program.
Gentlemen, let's come briefly to India-Pakistan relations. A few days ago, it was announced that the two countries are going to start a composite bilateral dialogue. The foreign secretaries will be meeting in January to set out the modalities, and one believes that the actual talks will start fairly soon thereafter. How is this viewed in America by the Obama administration?
With huge relief. And I think from the American point of view, we would like to see India and Pakistan resolve their differences. But they have to be done bilaterally. We can only encourage it. And I think that it's very much in America's interest to encourage it. But when I contrast it, and I think it's worth noting, with the subject that I was dealing with, the Israeli-Palestinian issue, where the leaders are not talking anymore. They live, 40 minutes apart, and there's no dialogue, no real dialogue going on there. The idea that Pakistan and India can, after so many years and so much strife between them, actually sit down and start talking face to face about these issues is very encouraging.
Except that they weren't sitting down and talking for several months prior to this. There was a sense in which the two countries and perhaps their leaders were sulking with each other. Is that why you say there's huge relief that they've now decided to sit down and talk?
Yeah, look, I just think that jaw is better than war, as Churchill said. And
it's realistic relief, let's put it that way.
One concern in India's Strobe Talbot is that Pakistan is simply not doing enough over the 2611 cases. 6 American citizens got killed in that terrible terror attack. India is also concerned by the way Pakistan treats Hafiz Saeed, and you yourselves have declared him a terrorist. You've actually offered a $10 million bounty for information leading to his arrest. Now, there's little doubt that India can't do very much more to force Pakistan to act. But is Washington equally helpless, or is this just an issue of not high priority for America?
No, I think it's a very high priority for America, and coming from Washington, I can tell you that both of us have heard American officials say that it's very important that Pakistan buy on to a very simple proposition, which is that there's no such thing as good terrorists that can be left alone and bad terrorists that we have to go over. The terrorists are terrorists, and it's got to be a 360 struggle, and a very tough one to get rid of them.
The problem is this, I suppose, that when in November General Raheel Sharif, the Pakistan Army chief, visited Washington, both Vice President Biden and Secretary of State Kerry publicly praised him for the battle that he's waging against Pakistan Taliban. But did either of the two gentlemen ask him, why aren't you waging a similar fight against LET and Jaish and the Pakistani-based jihadi groups that attack India? Was that question asked, or was it diplomatically forgotten?
No, I don't believe it's forgotten at all. You yourself pointed out that 6 Americans were killed as a result of an LET attack, a terrible attack in Mumbai. So this is not something that slips off the radar screen. We do have an interest in Pakistan putting meaningful curbs on the Taliban and fighting the Pakistan Taliban, which they are doing. But that does not diminish our interest in seeing them act against LET, not just because it's a threat to India, but because we also believe it's a threat to Pakistan.
Except for the fact, if that question was asked, and I have no reason to doubt what Mr. Indik is saying, that it doesn't slip off the table, was it ignored by the Pakistanis? Because they're not taking any action against LET, they're not taking any action against Jaish, and India has had 2 small terror attacks earlier this year in Gurdaspur and Udhampur. So if you're asking the question, is Pakistan refusing to hear, or at least answer?
Well, or take action. That's the thing. It's not a matter of hearing and thinking, it's a matter of taking action, and I think Martin has addressed that very well.
But then how do you get Pakistan to act? Or is that nothing you can do?
Well, if we could actually get them to do it, we would have done it a long time ago. We keep trying.
I think it's critical that in the first instance we make sure that there are no attacks coming from Pakistan against India, and then to get them to put real curbs, to shut these people down.
But is Washington becoming a little frustrated or anxious at any rate by the fact you ask questions, the questions are heard, but action isn't taken?
Look, there are multiple frustrations in Washington, abundant frustrations. I think that what really matters here is what I said, and what Strobe said, is that Pakistan cannot be allowed to get away with the notion that there is some distinction between good terrorists and bad terrorists. And that's rejected in Washington. And by the way, you refer to the Chief of Army Staff of Pakistan. He himself said it. So we need to hold them to account in that regard and keep at it.
But they're very good at wriggling out.
Yes, but hopefully we learn over time and become more effective in dealing with it.
So is your advice to Mr. Modi, grit your teeth and carry on with the talks? We are with you on the question of terror, but Pakistan is a difficult customer to bring to the table.
I wouldn't say that that's my advice. It's not my position to give him advice, but I think that is, from what I can see and what I hear, including from you, that's exactly what he's doing.
All right, gentlemen, let's leave it there. My thanks to both of you for joining me. And there we end this particular episode. If you have been, thanks for watching. Goodbye. Good night.